Jason Fried is our featured guest for the Nonprofit Productivity Summit. He's the founder and CEO of 37 Signals, the makers of Basecamp and Hey, a fantastic, relatively new email app, which I personally use and really enjoy. Jason, welcome to the summit.
Thanks for having me here.
So let's start by talking about asynchronous work, asynchronous communication. I'm such a believer that this is a mindset as much as it is a series of practices. And like many for-profit companies, so many nonprofits during the pandemic shifted to remote and async. And I think a lot of them probably went remote and limped along on the async side, did the best they could. What would you say in terms of how is truly asynchronous work the key to making remote work truly effective?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The problem with the way a lot of companies have adopted or organizations have adopted remote work is that they've actually a lot of them switched to sort of real time, and that like everything has to be a Zoom call or everything has to be a video thing or everything has to be a real time chat. And that's pretty draining, for a whole organization to constantly have to be live when they're not actually nearby because it's taxing. So the beauty of asynchronous is that people can think things through and write things up and present things as such, and then other people can get to those things when they have a chance. So you don't need to sync up schedules. You don't need to pull people off the work they're doing. You don't need to line up a big meeting. You don't need to have a big video call when people don't want to be on video. You don't have to worry about what's behind you. Like, am I in my bedroom? Like, everyone's got all the weird situations now at home. And you can instead just kind of write things up and present things as complete thoughts without having to be on stage, and people can respond, over time. So that's one of the beauty. It's actually it's a calmer, more paced way of working, less sprinting, less running, less trying to sync things up. And it just, as you get used to it, it can feel slower, and it kind of is in some ways, but it's actually quite a bit quicker in other ways. But it feels like the real natural way to do this well.
I know for me, when I first started with async, I felt guilty not talking to team members every day. And I know that a lot of nonprofit leaders, they're people pleasers, they're yes people, they want to serve. And it is very awkward to not necessarily talk to your team members every day. What do you think about that?
I mean, you can just write to them every day. I think that, one thing that we do is we do have a number of real-time conversations, but they're between two people. So the people who are literally working on something together, in our case, our teams are sizes of two. We've made these really small teams intentionally, one programmer, one designer. They're in fairly regular communication throughout the day. And I think that's great. I think it's when you start to layer on 4 or 5 or 6 people and try to line up 6 schedules and have a 1-hour call. That's 6 hours of time you just spent. Even though it's only a 1-hour call, there's 6 people, each dedicating an hour to the call. That's when it starts to get really expensive and I think hard to manage. So I think every team's a bit different. For example, here at 37 Signals, we have once a week, each individual broader team, so like the design team, will hang out for an hour on a video call, more in a social context, just kind of catching up with each other, what's going on. Maybe people will show some work, but it's not like about work. So there's enough. I found that like once a week is enough for everyone to kind of get together. And then as needed throughout the period of time between those two sessions, individual people can get together when they need to work on something together. But we don't have these scheduled constant conversations like daily stand-ups or anything like that, which is, I think, quite invasive actually, and very time consuming for the value that you actually get out of them. So, but again, everyone's different. And it might be a matter of, some people really want more FaceTime. Other people may not. We have some people here who like just don't want it at all. And other people who want it some more, especially new people. It's really good, especially when you bring someone new onto the team, to spend more FaceTime with them in a sense. Someone who's been here for 12 years doesn't need it as much. So it's not one size fits all. It's paying attention to the situation. And different people and different leaders need different things. But in general, I think it's best to get used to being more asynchronous, and then you can always fall back to real time versus making everything real time, because then you'll never fall back to asynchronous.
No, that's a great point. Does 37 Signals, I know you guys are growing rapidly these days, do you tend to lean more introvert than extrovert, or would you say it's pretty balanced?
I would say we're more introverted in general. We have like a support team, customer support team, which is actually the biggest team in the company, which is made up majority introverted folks, or sorry, extroverted folks, because they're really into helping others, and it's a different sort of approach. Although our introverts like to help others too, but in a different capacity. So I would say we're probably like, I would say like probably 70% introverted. And I think that's, you know, it's good and bad for remote working. Remote working can be isolating, and you would assume that introverts want that, but isolation is another level of deprivation that is not really comfortable. You know, you don't want people to feel isolated. People should feel like they can be on their own. They don't feel like they need other people, but the feeling of isolation is not something you're after. So you still have to keep an eye on that. Even when people sort of want to be on their own, you want to make sure they're still involved with others. That's really important, I think, from a manager's point of view.
And I heard you in another interview where you said it's so important to give people just the space to at least say that. I've had that, and I think early on as a manager, my first instinct was, well, what's wrong with you? Just figure it out and learn how to work remotely. And as I get older, I realized that was not the optimal response. And it's not always easy. It can be isolating. I want to shift gears and talk about constraints. And I know this is, an emphasis of 37 Signals. A lot of software companies, I'm sure, are working in some form of blocks. And for our nonprofit, we work in 5-week blocks. And I guess I'm hoping you can kind of like diagnose the patient. Where we struggle is we hit the last stage of a sprint or a block. We don't want to let things go. We want to carry them over to the next block, even though we know we have agreed we wouldn't, even though we probably shouldn't. And what's your counsel for nonprofit teams who might be in a similar situation?
Yeah, typically when that happens, you're waiting too long to evaluate where you're at. So, you don't want to wait until that last week to go, where are we at? And I don't know if that's exactly what you're doing, but I'm guessing it's probably sort of what you do. And then you look at that and go, gosh, we have more work to do than we thought. There's only 1 week to go. We need more time. This is oftentimes better done earlier in the, you call it block, we call it cycle, whatever it is. A couple weeks in, you should figure out like where you're at so far. Look at how much time you have left. You always want to have more time left than spent when you make this evaluation, and begin to cut, or to begin to creatively problem solve, or begin to restate the problem. And you continue to do this as you go, but the later you do it, the harder it is to ever do it well. And that's why you end up sort of bleeding into the next block in that case. This will happen to us occasionally too. It's hard. This is hard, but the earlier you do it, the better off you are, because that's when you can really make the big cuts or make the big decisions, or even have the time to contemplate. Like, you might want to mull this over for 3 days. Well, if you're on Monday and the thing's due Friday, and this is your 5th week, mulling it over for 3 days seems like you can't even do that. You don't have any time to even think, because you're like, every day is incredibly precious right now. We're down to the 11th hour. You want to find yourself, at the first hour, basically, where you make those calls and cuts. So that's what I would encourage you to do, is just to do it earlier and more often after that, and see how things are going earlier.
Yeah. So that seeing how things are going, I'm sure a lot of that is through writing, through thoughtful comments, through thoughtful messages, memos, whatever it is. And I know that you and David have emphasized this a lot. I think that, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but I think one of you said at one point, if I had 2 candidates of similar quality in terms of work ethic and know-how, I'm going to take the better writer. And I find in the nonprofit space, that's a struggle for a lot of nonprofit leaders. They tend to first think verbal. They tend to first think pick up the phone or have in person, and they don't perceive I know I'm making broad statements here, but they don't perceive the written word to be as effective. They know it's valuable, but they don't necessarily think it's as effective. And so we've been working hard to try to shift that, because we think it's just as effective. It's just a different form of communication. But how do you help people at 37 Signals improve their writing, build more confidence in their writing so that, again, you can have that async mindset and methodology? What are your thoughts on the writing aspect of that?
Yeah. So part of it is we select for good writers when we hire. So that's one of the first things we look at, actually. And there's some disadvantages there because you might miss some wonderful people who aren't great writers for one reason or another. But we tend to find that that's a valuable skill for the way we work, and it's sort of an important way for the way we work. One of the things is whenever I see someone writing and they write too much, like that's, I think oftentimes people will write too much actually and be too wordy. And I think one way to counteract that is, as a leader, to make sure that my writing is concise and relatively brief, and sort of set that tone, that example that this is all you need, actually. You don't need to write 3 pages, maybe 1 page is better, and just sort of get to the point. And sometimes you'll mentor someone or help them or read something they wrote and suggest some edits or whatever it might be. But I think that people will follow kind of the patterns that are laid out by people with more seniority or more pull in the organization or something. So I think that's important. There's no question that getting on the phone is really useful too. Like I want to be clear that we're not against that at all. In fact, we'll start with writing. Oftentimes we'll end with writing, but sometimes we'll have a conversation that will kind of go on and like sort of talking past each other, or like someone's not making a clear point, and we'll say like, it's time for a call. And we'll sort of elevate something to a call. So we think calls are precious and really great, but just like anything that's precious, if you overuse them, it's not precious anymore. It becomes sort of rote, and you don't really appreciate the power of it. So sort of implementing a degree of scarcity, I think, is important there. So we will elevate things to a call, and that's when we can really get to the point when we absolutely need to. But it's sort of a last resort in a sense. But it's not seen as a negative. It's just like, let's work it out until we can't this way, then we'll work it out that way. And the reason why, again, we think that's a last resort is just because it's more time consuming. It pulls people off of their work in a sense, and we have to sync up schedules, which is always hard, especially across time zones and countries, which is where we're sort of spread everywhere around the world now. So it's especially hard for us. Anyway, that's the other thing I would say is when writing in a business setting, people tend to be a bit too formal, I think, and it's better. We try to encourage people to just write like they would speak. So write a little bit more casually, more conversationally, and don't try to be so proper, because I think you actually lose a lot of meaning when you try to do that. So anyway, it's sort of hard in a sense. I feel like I'm not really being, my answer is not really helpful because it's so hard to really show you how someone becomes a better writer. But those are some of the principles and ideas around it, I think, that help.
I think it's helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, for
Okay.
like an executive director, when they're doing their monthly or quarterly report to their board, there's a way to write professionally and still be brief. It's not too casual. There's a way, and if there's good trust there, I hear you. What do you think the nonprofit space can learn from companies like 37 Signals? Besides everything we've just been talking about, but I guess sort of in
Well,
general, can we be learning from the for-profit space?
my experience interacting with a lot of nonprofits is very interesting, because nonprofit is almost a word that doesn't mean anything really in terms of structure, because there's some massive nonprofits and there's a lot of small, tiny volunteer-based organizations that have like 4 people. So it's really hard to draw. Just like I wouldn't say a company like a small company shouldn't probably look to Amazon.com. A small for-profit company shouldn't look to Amazon.com or Apple, the most profitable company in the world, for how they should run, because Apple has 12,000 employees and you might have 4. So it's more about, I think, looking at the right scale, and not necessarily looking to for-profit or nonprofit, but like, what other organizations at this scale, what are they doing? And one of the suggestions I would generally have is that smaller teams are better. And in many ways, fewer voices are better. it's one of the things I've run into with volunteer-based organizations specifically is that people are a little bit nervous about making decisions. They want to make sure everyone's sort of equally represented in the decision, and there's a sort of a sense of um, it's more about consensus versus actually like a decision. I've just seen this, and again, I'm generalizing, but I've seen this a little bit more on the nonprofit side than I have on the for-profit side. I think it's just more of a sense of like, especially in volunteer organizations, which not all nonprofits are, of course, but in volunteer-based organizations, I should say, there isn't necessarily the same sense of responsibility. Like, it's my job and I'm being evaluated on this to make a good decision. So it's more about how do we all feel about this? And it's not really necessarily a clear decision. So I would just think about, like, again, decisions are ultimately made by one person. People can contribute points of view and thoughts, but a person has to make the call. So I think having someone who's literally responsible for this call is very important. That in your organization or others, it might be fine. That might be how it's already done, but I've seen it not always done that way. That's my only thing I would think would be really important, other than, again, smaller teams. We believe the ideal size is typically 2, sometimes 3. As you go beyond that, I think it just gets more complicated to do anything. And especially when people's, it's not someone's full-time focus. And this can happen in volunteer organizations where there's a lot of people involved sort of on the side. They've only got a few hours here and there to really contemplate or think about it. Things aren't really thought through well enough. No one's really in charge, and they can kind of just float. So I don't know if that resonates at all, but
For sure. Yeah.
that's been my experience and I don't have a lot of it, but that's my experience. Yeah.
It's mine as well. There's a lot of, let's make sure we all get around the table, because we'd feel bad if we weren't. And
Yep.
And I had a supervisor once who said, it's really about guts at the end of the day, because that means you make a decision and you anticipate that there will be some pushback, and you have to just acknowledge that on the front end. I want to ask you about Hey, because to me, again, this is about decision making. And 37 Signals had made multiple products and then had gone to Basecamp. And then I guess, I mean, you've talked about it in different spaces of being almost like a calling, like you had to make an email app. What was that relatively easy to say to the whole team? Hey, everybody, big news. This is going to change the face of our business for a while. Or was there more to it than that? Was it just like, we just have to do it? It's like a calling, and that's going to guide the decision.
It started out as something else and then became that. It started out, we were simply exploring, okay, really stepping back. We used to have a product called Highrise, which we still do for existing customers, but we haven't sold it to new customers for years. So it's kind of like phasing it out, but we'll support existing customers. It's a CRM kind of product. And we had some new ideas. Some new ideas had bubbled up around it. And we said, what if we explored bringing it back? What would that look like? So we began to explore that. And in that exploration, we realized we were basically building this email thing. And we're like, I actually want this for all my emails. This is not just like business contacts, but like there's something here. You just sort of get the sense that we're onto something. We need to pull this thread a bit more. And this is just 3 of us exploring in the early days. So we didn't change the face of the company, didn't pull a bunch of people off. It's just 3 of us screwing around, essentially exploring something. And a few months later, it became clear that we had something, and they would slowly layer in more people. And eventually we had some more. And we realized so it took us all in about 2 years to build this. But for the second year of it, we basically halted development on Basecamp for a little bit to put all of our resources into finishing Hey, so we could get that out. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to do it. So that's where it changed the business for a little bit, and that's Basecamp didn't progress for a little bit. But now we're able to work on both things simultaneously. So we've hired a bunch more people now that we know that Hey is something that's going to be here. We can hire up, support both products at once, and build them simultaneously. So there was kind of a temporary change, but as far as like we had to do it, we did have this itch, and what we had to do was fulfill the follow the energy. We just had this sense that we were onto something, and you don't get that often. When you do, and you're really into it, and you want it for yourself, we just felt we're gonna do this. People were excited about it internally, although not everybody was, because some people had a lot of doubts. It was unusual. We had a lot of weird. It's an unusual product. It's very different from most email things, and so some people who were using it internally didn't understand it initially, and so there's some hesitation there, but we felt like it was a good product, and we got out and it turned out to be a big success, which is wonderful. But you never really know until you put it out there. But anyway, it's the way we are is very fluid. So we don't sit down and make long-term decisions about exactly what we're going to do. We do, and we say, do we want to do more of that? And if we do, we keep doing more of that. And do we want to keep doing more of that? What's it going to take to do more of that? And you just sort of find this equilibrium in the organization where you're able to do what you want to do in a way that's going to make sense, and you do it until you're done. And then 6 weeks at a time, of course, in these cycles. But then you get it out and you're done, and then you see how the company or the organization has to react at that point with, now we have to support two big things. How do we do that? That's where the hiring came from, that sort of thing. So it's a bit of a amorphous process, but it's just how it is.
Yeah, and I know for many attendees of this summit, they're working from the context of a strategic plan, and it feels almost sacrilegious to just say, oh, we're only going to work in this cycle, and we're going to keep going with this particular event or program or resource until we feel like it's done. And that can feel overly simplistic, but I think what you're saying is it can actually be really prudent, because sometimes something is out of steam, and it's okay to say this is done, or we're going to add something new.
Yeah, it is a different way of working. And it's, in my opinion, more of a recognition of the fragility. That's maybe the wrong word. The sort of the blind spots of human nature. The sense that we think we can plan out everything we want to do over a long period of time. I don't think humans are very good estimators. We think we are, but we're often way off. And anyone who's watching this can just ask themselves honestly, the last 3 things you estimated that was like months and months and long, like, did you land there, or did it take months more than you thought? Or like, let's just be honest, right? It's just, we're not good at it. Humans collectively aren't good at it. And so this idea of building as you go, time boxing it, roughly 6 weeks, or in your case 5 at a time, is just, in my opinion, the more like honest way to approach work. Saying like, we know if we give this more time, it'll keep going. It'll go and it'll go and it'll go and it'll go. And there's a 6-month version of this, 2-year, but let's see what we can do in 6 weeks and build that. And then we have another 6 weeks to think about what we want to do next, and what we want to do next, what we want to do next. And so this constant reevaluation, I think, is really healthy. It takes context into account in a way that long-term planning does not. You don't know what you're going to bump into over the long term. Over the short term, you have a pretty good chance. And even if you don't know, you just bumped into it, so you know what it is, so you can make an adjustment if you need to. I just find that to be the natural way to do these things, even though you do have to put a lot on faith that we'll figure it out over time. But I just think it's a more honest way to really approach problems. Yeah.
I've found it to be kind of addictive. Once you get used to breaking it into chunks and blocks, it's really hard to go back to that kind of, like you say, 2 or 3 year out planning, because really, if we're honest, the world is changing so fast and people's needs adjust and change. So no, I've drunk the Kool-Aid, so I'm an easy sell.
Yeah.
Our special guest is Jason Fried, founder and CEO of 37 Signals. Jason, in closing, any final advice for nonprofit leaders that you'd like to share or give?
For whatever reason, I've always found it odd that organizations either identify as like nonprofit or for-profit. I mean, that's just like essentially kind of the business model or whatever. I think it's better to identify with like what it is that you're doing. And I suppose many do as well. But I've always found the distinction to be just slightly it's just sort of like in my way of thinking, it's almost like or inconsequential. It's like, do you make money or do you not? But
Yeah.
like, what are you doing? And so I would just think again about what are you doing? I think that embrace the power of small teams. And this is the other thing I think that's interesting about the nonprofit world is that nonprofits typically are dependent upon outside funding and donations, and there's never quite enough. And I would look at that. I mean, I know it's not an advantage in terms of serving people, but like in terms of the number of people you can hire or how big the organization can be, it's probably naturally going to be a bit smaller. And that's a good thing. There's a lot of power in smaller teams and smaller organizations. You can do a lot more things actually in surprising ways. You can do small things. Big organizations can't actually do small things, and a lot of the things that need to be done are small things. So don't look at it as a disadvantage, but look at it as an advantage. I think that's one of the really fundamental things that I think is important to keep in mind when you're a bit more constrained, perhaps, than a different type of organization might be.
Thanks so much for being our guest. We really appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you.